want to thank everyone for joining us to commemorate Yom HaShoah Tafshin Pei, our annual Yom HaShoah commemoration. And although we are all restricted in our movements and we live in a time of great fear and uncertainty, it would truly be unfortunate if this difficult time resulted in us neglecting our duty to honor the memory of the 6 million who were ruthlessly taken from us. As once again, our brethren and the world at large are in danger, tonight's program will begin with a recitation of 2 chapters of Tehillim. We recite these psalms in merit that those who are ill should experience a speedy recovery and that we should all be blessed to remain safe and healthy. We're going to recite Psalm number 121, chapter 121, and chapter 130. If you kindly respond along with me. Shir Lamalos, Esa enai hel harim, my ayin yavo Ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai osei shamayim va'aretz. Ayiten lamot raglacha al yanum shomerecha. Hine lo yanun v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. Adonai shomerecha, Adonai tzelacha al yad yaminecha. Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka b'yareach balayla. Adonai yishmorcha mikol ra, yishmor es nafshecha. Adonai yishmor tzescha uvoecha mi'ata v'yad olam. Chapter 130, Perek Kuf Lamed. Shir Hamalos, Mimamakim, Krasicha Adonai. Adonai Shema B'Koli, Tiyena Oznecha Kashuvos, L'Kol Tachanunai.
Adonai Shema B'Koli, Tiyena Oznecha Kashuvot, L'Kol Tachanunai.
Im Avonos Tishmorya, Adonai Mi Ya'amod.
Avonos Tishmorya, Adonai Mi Ya'amod.
Ki imcha haslicha leman tivarei.
Ki imcha haslicha leman tivarei.
Ki vis Adonai kivsa nafshi v'lidvaro hochalti.
Vis Adonai kivsa nafshi v'lidvaro hochalti.
Nafshi l'Adonai mishomerim laboker shomerim laboker.
Adonai mishomerim laboker shomerim laboker.
Yachel Yisrael el Adonai ki im Adonai hachesed v'arbei imofedus.
El Israel el Adonai ki im Adonai hachesed v'arbei imofedus.
V'hu yifta es Yisrael mikol avonosav.
Es Yisrael mikol avonosav.
Chazan Malavani will now recite the Mishaberach L'Cholim.
Mishaberach Avoseinu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov, Moshe Aaron David u'Shlomo, ואימוסינו שרה רבקה רחל ולאה, הוא יברך וירפא את כל החולים מבית הכנסת עטרת צבי. הרופא לשבורי לב ומחבש לעצבוסם, מצמיח ישועות בורר רפואות שיברי אליך ותרפאני. הוא יברך וירפא את כל חולי הקורונה בכל עשר ועשר בעולמנו, בעבור שכולנו מתפללים בעבורם ולשלומם. בישכר זה הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחמים עליהם להחלימם ולרפאם ולהחזיקם ולהחיוסם וישלח לכל עמו ישראל ולכל אזרחי העולם מהרה רפואה שלמה מן השמיים לרמח איבריהם ושסה גידיהם רפואת הנפש ורפואת הגוף ידבר במהרה מגפה ומזור ויצילנו מכל צרה וצוקה, מכל נגע ומחלה, אשתה בגלה בזמן קריב, ונאמר אמן.
Thank you, Chazan. We tend to get caught up in numbers. 6 million people, 1.5 million children. The numbers are staggering. I do not think any of us could truly relate to them. Someone once told me that if we observe 1 minute of silence for every one of our brothers and sisters who were murdered in the Holocaust, we would be remaining silent for over 11 years. There is no grasping the magnitude of the devastation during those years. And despite the large number, we all know that for a family that loses one loved one, the loss of just that one person is a source of unbearable pain. I want to share with you a very brief story. During the Eichmann trials in 1961, there was an Israeli prosecutor named Gabriel Bach. When he was younger, he and his family fled Europe just before Hitler arrived. He was a prosecutor during the Eichmann trials, and he was interviewing a survivor in court named Dr. Martin Foldy. And Foldy was recounting his experiences during the war. And he described how he arrived in Auschwitz in 1944 with his wife, his son, and his young daughter. They were ordered to line up in a line to appear before the camp doctor. And the doctor was directing some people to the right and some people to the left. He was told to go to the right. His wife and his two children were told to go to the left. And there were a lot of people there, tremendous commotion, and it was hard for him to see his family. But he happened to have bought his young daughter a bright red coat. And he was able to see this bright red coat, the only sight of his family he was able to see. And he watched how this little red coat began to get smaller and smaller as she walked further from him. The survivor said, "This is how my family disappeared from my life." After the survivor spoke, the judge asked the prosecutor to continue speaking, but he stood there in silence. He was not able to say a word. And years later, someone asked the prosecutor why he did not say anything following the survivor's testimony. And he said because he and his wife, just a few days earlier, bought a little red coat for his own daughter, and no words were able to leave his mouth. Who knows how different the world would be today if those 1.5 million children were allowed to grow up, to marry, and to have children. The Jewish world most definitely would be vastly different today. And probably the entire world would have been altered as well. How many cures, inventions, books were lost when these 1.5 million children were murdered? We will never know, but tonight we mourn their loss as we do each and every year. Our program this evening will consist of a presentation from Rabbi Weil, which he researched in great depth, which will be followed by the recitation of the Kel Mali Rachamin at the end of the presentation and the singing of Ani Mamin. Our guest speaker this evening is Rabbi Stephen Weil. Rabbi Weil grew up in upstate New York on a cattle farm. He was formerly the rabbi of the Young Israel of Oak Park in Michigan, and then the rabbi of Beth Jacob Congregation in Beverly Hills, California. In 2009, he became the chief executive officer of the Orthodox Union. He is truly a captivating speaker who has delivered invocations for former President Bush, Governor Schwarzenegger, Speaker John Boehner, and to House representatives. He is a friend of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue who has addressed our community on prior occasions. We're truly honored to have him join us this evening. His topic tonight is Sonderkommando, remembering the lives of the rarest and most tragic survivors. Please give your attention to Rabbi Weil.
Rabbi Babbage, thank you very much. Can you hear me, Rabbi Babbage?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. The story that Rabbi Babbage told, Gabriel Bach is a fascinating man. Over the last couple of years, I've actually spent 5 hours in his apartment interviewing him. And he shared that story twice. In fact, that story is the story that Steven Spielberg used for Schindler's List. But this Gabriel Bach, who went on to be a Supreme Court justice in Israel, he himself is a living legacy. His family barely escaped Germany, and his story is one of the great stories of the Jewish people. I want to thank Rabbi Babbage, Chazan Malavani, and I want to thank our president, Jacob Gold, and the great men and women, the great families of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. Yom HaShoah is something that the Fifth Avenue Synagogue has lived for very many decades, because one of your regular members, of course, was Eli Wiesel, Zichrono Livracha. And each and every one of you befriended him, made him feel part and parcel, a major force in this great institution. And Eli was the voice for those who had no voice. And he was the conscience for those who could not articulate their conscience. And we know that your shul was always at the lead when it came to these issues, as many, many others. This evening, as the rabbi mentioned, our topic is the Sonderkommando. I want to start with a gentleman, a very fine man, who as a young boy went to Auschwitz. And he was chosen, not something he chose on his own, by the Germans there, and sent to an area at the far end of Birkenau to become a member of the Sonderkommando, in English, the Special Forces. This man never told his story. Like many others, he was one of what I would call Hitler's Shidduchim. He was the only one who survived his family. There were no grandparents, no siblings, no parents, barely anyone from his town. He was all alone in a DP camp. And he meets his wife. She was from Hungary. Same story. Her whole family was wiped out. In a million years, a Hungarian woman is not going to meet a man from Poland and marry. But like so many others, they were all alone in the world, all alone in a DP camp. And they married. And they started their life, and they came to California. He initially was in the trades, worked for others in construction, was successful and was able to create his own construction company, built homes, developed California. And this was a man who never talked about his experience in the Sonderkommando. His wife never knew, his daughters never knew, and he had wonderful daughters. Only there was one member in the community who had been in Auschwitz, who knew about him. But this man, his whole life, was focused on his business. When he retired, he shut down. He totally shut down. They got him the best doctors, psychologists, neurologists, physical therapy, and no doctor could find anything wrong with him. Here was a man that functioned, that worked 10, 12 hours a day for 50 years of his life, and then he just sat there in a chair, and then he used to go stare into space. They tried getting him a puppy. They used to visit him often. His wife tried her best, his daughters, the grandchildren, and he just, a couple of words a day. What happened? They didn't know, and we'll never know. But it seemed that all that he went through those years, that he kept suppressed, that he squelched, it came out. And it came out in a haunting way. And what haunted me is just looking at his face, that tortured face staring off into oblivion. And that was the first member of the Sonderkommando that I ever met. Who were the Sonderkommando, and why were they so unique? They're the ones who observed the murder of our people, 1/3 of our nation, 1.5 million children. They're the ones who observed it directly, firsthand, and over a significant amount of time. And there are very few of them. One survivor of Belzec. One. There were 18 survivors of Sobibor, one that was there in the Sonderkommando. Treblinka, a few. Auschwitz, you could count them on more than 2 hands. And we'll explain why there were more than 1 or 2 that survived Auschwitz. We'll get to that later. But their story, they're the witnesses. When Heinrich Himmler, when he had SS leadership, it was a famous meeting in Posen, where he had leaders of the SS. It was October 4th, 1943, and he said to them the following. He created something called Sonderkommando 1005. That job was to go throughout Europe. Now that they had almost annihilated the largest group of European Jewry, over 3 million Polish Jews had been annihilated. In Belgium, 600,000 Galician Jews. In Treblinka, 892,000 Polish Jews. And in Sobibor, 250,000 Jews, primarily Polish, some Dutch. This group, Sonderkommando 1005, they would go into the Ukraine, they would go into those 3 camps, they would go into Vilna Panari forest, to Ramula, the forest outside of Latvia, where Riga Jewry was killed, and remove all remains. And I want to quote what Himmler said. He says, this is a glorious page in our history, in the history of Deutschland, but it never has been, or will it ever be written. No trace, no survivor. And that's why the Sonderkommando, every 90 days, they were annihilated, because God forbid they should ever survive to tell the story. What happened? How, when they first came, every one of them described, they wanted to kill themselves. They wanted to die. Many of them said, all I wanted to do was to jump into the fire and be incinerated with my brothers and sisters. But many of them didn't have the guts to commit suicide. Many of them felt that there had to be a witness. Someone had to tell the story. But when they described themselves, consistently you hear the term, we were robots. I became a robot. I lost all my feelings. Some said there were no more feelings. I couldn't cry. One of the great works on the Sonderkommando was an Israeli historian, Gideon Greif. He interviewed, serious quality interviews. This was published by Yale University. 7 members of the Sonderkommando who survived Auschwitz, who survived Birkenau. And the name of the book is We Wept Without Tears. I couldn't cry. We wept without tears. I wasn't a human. I couldn't feel. What did they do? They're the ones who had to pull out gold teeth. They're the ones who had to search the cavities of their fellow Jews for hidden items, for precious jewels. They had to remove rings off of dead women. They're the ones who couldn't tell the truth to their fellow Jews. They couldn't look them in the face when they said, what's happening? Where are we? Where are we going? They're the ones who had to drag and burn the corpses, not of thousands, but of hundreds of thousands of children, of elderly, of men, women, of rabbis. They're the ones who had to stoke the coals. Stoke, not coals, but bodies, the way we would stoke a bonfire. They're the ones who, if there were any ashes that accumulated, they had to gather the ashes. In Auschwitz, they took them and they spread them in the Vistula River. That's what they did. They were the most vulnerable, and they were the most wanted by the Nazis because they would become the eyewitnesses. They would be the ones who could bear witness to the world. And the Sonderkommando knew that. And they knew that once the transport stopped, whether it's in Belgium, where they were the last ones annihilated, Sobibor, Treblinka, and understand, there's a revolt in Sobibor. He passed away a few years ago. One of the most crucial members of that revolt was a Jew from Izbitz, or we say in Polish, Izbica. His name was Thomas Tuviablat. Fascinating story and memoir. This is a man who came to California, did well there, but he never left Sobibor. He would go back and back and back. He never left there. But the revolt that was led, there were a number of Jewish communists. They were members of the Soviet army, and they were capable. And they had a revolt. And no one expected to live. They knew they were going to die. But 18 survived. And the same thing was true with Treblinka. When did it happen? It happened when there was no one else to kill, because there were no Jews left in Poland. It happened when they would be the last. They had nothing to lose. If anything, they described that their death was liberating. Why? Because instead of the Germans determining when we were going to die, we determined when we would die. But a few did survive. We're going to talk about the only survivor of Belzec. Do you understand the rich history of all of Galician Jewry, Western Galician Jewry, the area of Krakow, the areas of Schwenchen, Central Galician Jewry, areas like Tarnów, Eastern Galicia, Lvov, Lemberg, Tarnopol? No one survived. There were two survivors. One's man's name was Chaim Hirschman. The day that he went to testify in a Polish court, in a Polish tribunal, they murdered him. He was murdered by Polish Catholics. The only survivor, we don't have his testimony. The only survivor, and we're going to speak about him later, is a man by the name of Rudolf Redder. Rudolf Redder, his testimony we have. This was translated into English from the Polish testimony by Auschwitz Museum. One survivor. Panari. No one suffered like Lithuanian Jewry. Of the 220,000 Lithuanian Jews, 3.6% survived. It was the worst annihilation percentage-wise in all of German-controlled Europe. And they brought in a few Lithuanians who were left, the last remnants of the Vilna ghetto, to burn the bodies in Panari. Panari, there were 100,000 human beings, probably about 80,000 Jews. Jews who had lived in Vilna and all the suburban communities and the villages in the area of Vilna. They were taken out and they were murdered, primarily by Lithuanians. It was overseen by the Einsatzgruppen A that oversaw the murder of Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian Jewry, Einsatzgruppen B as well. And there were tens of thousands of bodies. They were buried in these massive pits that the Russians, when they controlled Lithuania, were going to use for fuel storage. You know, in every city, there are major fuel storage sites. That's where they were buried. And they brought these Jews to burn the remains. And as the remains were almost completely burnt, there was an escape. And we have a couple of witnesses from Panari outside of Vilna. What was religious life like for the Sonderkommando? Redder described, they worked incredibly difficult days. The SS in Belzec were whimsical. They were sadistic. Christian Wirth oversaw Belzec and Sobibor and Treblinka, but the people who worked underneath him, as well as the Ukrainian guards, because most of those who worked were Ukrainians who answered to the SS, and they would murder Jews for no reason. I'm talking about the workers, not the people who were being annihilated upon arrival. He survived all of that, but he said, we had a minyan. We davened. We weren't going to give up our God. We might have become numb. We might have lost feeling, but we davened every day. Not during the day when they were working, back in the barrack at night. Do you know in Auschwitz, the Sonderkommando were not in the bunks. They were totally removed. They were isolated. They had no contact with anyone else in Birkenau. You know where they were housed? Not in the barracks that we see when we think of Birkenau. You know where they were housed? On top of the crematoria. The gas chambers were below. You went underground. That were the gas chambers. Above that were the crematoria, and above that were the barracks of the Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando didn't wear uniforms like all the other Jews who were slave laborers in Auschwitz. They wore regular clothing. They had a different caloric intake. The Germans were very, very careful that no one take a diamond or no one take gold or no one take a precious possession they took out of the cavities of their dead Jews. The food that people brought with them, that they didn't care about. And they actually had a better caloric intake than anyone else in Auschwitz. But that's where they were. You know what they did? Think about what you would bring. If you could only bring a few possessions, what would you take on your final destiny? They took from the coats of people who had come in to the gas chambers. What would happen before the gas chambers? In Yiddish, in German, in Polish, in Hungarian, in Italian, said, baths and inhalation. And the Germans would say to the people, please remember your number. We have hooks, we have every hook is numbered. Please hang your clothing properly there. If you have shoes that have ties, have strings, and then tie up your shoes in a knot and hang it on the hooks. And please remember your number, because after the bath, you're going to be going to work. You need to know where to get your clothing. So what did they have in their coats? People brought a machzer. People brought a siddur. There were actually 2 people who brought small Sifrei Torah. They carried it with them. So the Sonderkommando in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, above the crematoria where they were barracked, they had services. They worked 12-hour shifts. So if you davened, Kol Nidre and Mariv, you were working the next day. The people who worked the night shift, they davened Yom Kippur morning and said Yizkor. In those ovens of the crematoria in 1944, they baked matzahs. They tried to keep some semblance of religion. Can you imagine Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim telling the story of the Exodus when you're experiencing something much worse than what we experienced in Mitzrayim? Can you imagine having a Seder in a crematorium? It was a young boy. Man's name was Sam Itzkovitz. He came to Auschwitz actually just before his 18th birthday. And he describes how he wished he could have run to the electric fences, just kill himself. That's what he wanted. He says, I didn't have the guts. Because death was a lot easier than life. He says the Germans would tell the people, come in, shower, we're going to disinfect you. And there was always a Red Cross van. An SS person would come out of the Red Cross van, would have the Zyklon B, would go to the roof of the gas chambers and put the pellets in. And the doors were not opened until an SS doctor. He would have his SS uniform underneath and then wear a white cloak or a white medical robe. And what was the phrase? Everything is finished. And when he said everything is finished, he gave the word, then the Sonderkommando would come in with the straps and they would have to take out the bodies. 16 years after Auschwitz, Rabbi Babbage spoke about the Eichmann trial, about Gavriel Bach, about Gideon Hausner. I had the great honor of interviewing twice and spending a number of hours with his son, Amos, who's an attorney now in Israel, about his father and about the trial. So Israel paid. They told Adolf Eichmann, you can choose whatever defense you want. So who did he choose? A man by the name of Robert Sabatius. Robert Sabatius was the famous German attorney who defended many of the leaders of the Third Reich at the Nuremberg trials. Famous Nuremberg defense attorney. And he came to Israel with a team of attorneys. He was Eichmann's defense attorney. And understand, the 3 Israeli jurists, the judges, they all understood German. I believe 2 of them actually spoke it fluently. Gavriel Bach, who was a German Jew, also obviously it was his first language. So Servatius in the trial, he describes what happens at what we call the death camps, referred to it as a lager is a camp. He described it in medical terms. He would never use the word murder, would never use the word kill, genocide, extermination. No, always in sanitary medical terms. And one of the judges, he stops Servatius and he speaks to him in German, not in Hebrew. He said, you're talking about the murder, the butchering, the slaughtering of hundreds of thousands of people in each of these institutions, and you use medical terminology? It's murder that we're talking about. Servatius said, it was done by doctors, It was done by medical professionals. We use scientific terms. These were medical operations. And they were flabbergasted, the judges. So after the doctor leaves, then they come in. David Novosel described carrying bodies. Many of the people that came from the ghettos, particularly the Polish ghettos, they were emaciated by the time they got to Auschwitz. He says, every time I took a frail body of an elderly woman, I felt like I was carrying my mother. I just felt like I was carrying my mother who had been killed already. And he says, I just wanted to jump into the oven with the body. Philip Muller. Philip Muller was the longest acting of anyone who survived, the longest duration as a member of the Sonderkommando. His book is a very, very powerful one. This was a translation into English. Eyewitness Auschwitz. 3 years in the gas chambers. Philip Muller, maybe many of you remember, he broke down crying in Shoah when Claude Lanzmann was pushing him. He told a number of stories that were very powerful. Before Claude Lanzmann died, he sold to the Holocaust Museum in Washington and to Yad Vashem the outtakes. There were 180 hours of film that went in, that were cut down, edited into 9 hours. So the other 171 hours, we actually now have. It's on the website, the educational website at Yad Vashem, as well as the United States Holocaust Memorial. He's a very crucial eyewitness, Philip Muller, because he was there during the duration, before Birkenau was started to be built. He was in Auschwitz I, then he went to Birkenau. And he describes a scene. He couldn't go on anymore. He goes into the gas chambers, and here is he standing there. He's got his clothing on. He's standing there, is surrounded by naked women. And these two young women said to him, you cannot come here. You have to leave. Someone has to be an eyewitness. Someone's got to tell our story. And these young girls, instead of thinking about themselves, they're pushing him to the door. The German sees him by the door. The SS pulls him out. Schweinhund! We determine when you die, not you. He ended up, kicked him, smashed his teeth, went back to work. And as God would have it, this man survived. Yaakov Zilberberg, he was a religious Jew. He wanted to commit suicide, but there was another religious Jew there. He was the dayan of a town called Makov. And this dayan said to him, he says, Bal korchach atam, we know against your will you were born. Bal korchach atam chai, bal korchach atam mes, Chazal say. We don't determine when we die. That God determines. You're not. And he begged him, and he convinced him not to commit suicide. And this man survived. Not the dayan died. But this man who the dayan convinced not to commit suicide survived. Eliezer Eisenschmidt, who's one of the people that's interviewed in Gideon Greif's book, We Wept Without Tears, he describes that one day the Germans didn't need any slave laborers. They were at capacity. So they sent a whole train. There was no selection by the doctors, Mengele and the other SS doctors. But that train was unique. It was a whole community. That train was every man, woman, and child left living from a community, and they were annihilated in the course of an hour and a half. He saw what he thought was the rabbi. The man had a beard. He assumed that was the Rav, and he saw that how people were treating him. And he went over, trying to make sure that no S was looking at him. And he said to the rabbi, Rabbi, this is it. He says, when you go in there, say vidui, say the last confession with your people. And the Rav led his Kehillah in Shema Yisrael and in a vidui. Some Jews said nothing. They were stoic. Some held their children. It's the last chance to kiss your child, to embrace your child. Some, as we said vidui. Some could not believe they were going to die. They're saying, this was the German people. This is the most advanced civilized nation on earth. It's not possible. It's not possible that they would annihilate us. Some denied it to the very end. Sam Mickiewicz was the young man that came just around the time of his 18th birthday to Auschwitz and was taken and chosen to be in the Sonderkommando. He says, you know when I lost my faith? I lost my conviction when I saw what was being done to these children. What sin did they commit? Why were they brought into the world to be treated like this, to be tortured like this? I couldn't deal with it. But he said, there was a Jew, a member of the Sonderkommando. There was a Jew there. And you know what he did? He was a religious man. He didn't give up his faith. If anything, he became more committed. Every time a child was taken when we took them out of the gas chamber, and we put them on a conveyor belt up to the top, to the crematoria, we put them in an elevator, we lifted them up there, he would take that child. He said he held it like the way you would hold a Sefer Torah. He held it. He kissed every child, and he said Kaddish. And then he laid it like you're laying down a Sefer Torah. He laid that child on the adults before closing the crematoria door. He said he did that for thousands of Jewish children. He says, I couldn't get over that. The reverence I had for this man, this religious man, when I couldn't keep my faith. Mickiewicz, he described the flames, just the sight that he said, I can never get, the nightmares he had of the skin peeling off of their bodies from the fire. He says the stench of the burning of human flesh. He says, that smell haunts me. He says in the scene, just the horrific scenes of watching my brothers and sisters, my fellow Jews, 1/3 of world Jewry, Ashkenazic Jewry being annihilated. Rudolf Redder, the one survivor of Belzhitz. What was his story? Fascinating story for one reason to start with, for many to conclude. He was born in 1881. Do you know that when he came to Belzhitz, the man was 60 years old? Nobody was chosen to work at 60. 60 years old, he was sent away. That's why most survivors were kids in their teens, their late teens or their early 20s. This man was a chemist by trade. He lived in Lvov. You know, today it's Lviv in the Ukraine, but then in Poland it was Lvov. Or under the Austro-Hungarian Empire until World War I, it was known as Lemberg. Lemberg, as you know, was referred to, they built it as a model of Vienna. It was the Vienna of Galicia. And this man had a soap factory. He was a chemist, he had a soap factory. He had a daughter. She was one of the main physicians. Now, think about it. In the 1930s, there weren't that many women who became doctors. She was one of the main physicians of the Jewish hospital in Lvov. And what was known as the Grosse Aktion, the great action, was when the Germans removed almost everyone from Lvov. The date was August 16th, 1942. That's when he arrives to Belzhitz. His job is to dig mass graves. We're going to read in a few minutes a few pages of his testimony. He was a very handy man. And they had him doing mason work, as well as being there was no incinerators. There were no crematoria in Belzhitz and Treblinka and Sobibor. They had these, the Germans called them bunkers. There were mass graves of tens of thousands of people. And he was a grave digger, these mass pits in the ground. But they needed supplies. He did a lot of the mason work. 2 young SS men took him back to Lvov. They were going to buy supplies. 3 Polish girls, they see these 2 men in uniform looking good. The 3 girls started flirting with the 2 SS He never knew, was that to save him or is it because they were interested in flirting? Maybe they get some money, maybe be treated well by a German. As they're flirting with these soldiers, he says, I'm going to die anyways. No one survives Belgians. He runs. He runs in Lvov, and he escaped. They were busy. They didn't notice him until it was too late. He went to one of the people who worked in his soap factory, and he was hid in this guy's basement until the Russians liberated Lvov in late 44. Moved to Krakow, got married. You know what happened after the war in Poland. You're familiar with the pogrom in Krakow, the Kelsey pogrom. He gave testimony, this testimony in 1946 in Polish. And it's very powerful, and I'll tell you why. Many of the survivors we hear, it's something they've said to their children, to their grandchildren, when they go to a public school, when they speak at a shul, when they speak on Yom HaShoah. It's something that's referred to as the preferred narrative. He was speaking a year after liberation. It was raw, it was powerful, it was in his natural language, Polish. It was not anesthetized. Those are very powerful testimonies. Because of what was going on in Poland, they couldn't live there. No Jews lived in Poland, they fled. He went to Israel. I don't know the story. We really don't know his story. Maybe he couldn't make it financially in Israel. It was very tough in the early years. Like many survivors who tried to go to Israel and then settled in America, Canada, Australia. When the time for the Eichmann trial in 1961, that Rabbi Babbage was alluding to, he was no longer in Israel. He actually moved to Canada. And what's very strange, we don't know what happened. We don't know if he has any survivors, any children. Did he have children? We don't know. We don't know when he died. We don't know where he died. The only survivor of Belgium. Very mysterious story. All we have is this. I'd like to read from one of the few survivors of Treblinka. You understand, those of you who know the story of the Warsaw Ghetto. Polish Jewry was annihilated starting in the summer of 42 through 43 in Treblinka. Częstochowa is a famous Polish city. That's where they have the Black Madonna, the famous statue of the Virgin Mary that people come from all over to see. It's a Jewish community in Częstochowa. This man's name is Avram Bamba. Avram Bamba is known as the Barber of Treblinka. Bamba is a fascinating man. He settled at the end of his life in Miami. There's a 4.5-hour interview of him, a survivor testimony later in life. Landsman, and what I'm quoting you now is the transcription of the 9 hours of Shoah. Landsman interviewed him. And I want to just give you a small piece of that interview. So he's a barber in Treblinka. Landsman asked him, so you cut the hair of how many women in one batch? In one batch, there was about, I would say, probably 60, 70 women in the same room at one time. And afterwards, after you cut their hair, they went into the gas chamber? No, he says, not exactly. After we finished with this party, then another party of 70 women came in. So altogether, there were about 140 women at a time. They were already taken care of. And the SS told us to leave. So we pulled out for a number of minutes. And when they put in the gas, and remember, in Treblinka and Belzec and Sobibor, there was no Zyklon B. They were using diesel engines. It was a much longer and a much more painful death, choking to death on carbon monoxide poisoning. And then we were brought back. So where did you wait, Landsman asked him? Outside the gas chamber, on the other side. Well, on this side, the women went in. And on the other side, there was a group of Jews, Sonderkommando, who took out the dead bodies. Some of them were not always dead, because they weren't fully dead. They took them out, and then everything was clear. And it was clean to take in another party of 70 women and do the same thing that we did all over again. So Landsman asked me, he said, did most of the Jewish women have long hair? Most of them had long hair. Some had short hair. What we had to do was chop off the hair, like I mentioned. The Germans wanted the hair for their purposes. Landsman says, I asked you a question before and you didn't answer. What was your impression the very first time that you were put there with these naked women? Naked women arriving with their little children. Well, how did you feel? Bamba answers, I tell you something. To have a feeling about that, he paused. It was very hard to feel anything because working there day and night, between dead people, between bodies, your feeling disappeared. You were dead. You had no feeling at all. As a matter of fact, I want to tell you something that happened. At the gas chamber, when I was chosen to work there as a barber, some of the women that came in on a transport, they came from Częstochowa. I knew a lot of them. I knew them. They lived in the same part of town. Some of them lived in the same street that I lived on. Some of them were my close friends. And when they saw me, they started asking me, Abish, Avrami, what's going to happen to us? What was I going to tell them? What could I tell them? I had a friend of mine. He also was a barber. He was a very good barber from our hometown of Częstochowa. And his wife and his sister came in to get their hair cut. And he starts breaking down. Just as a strong man, I mean, a strong, gesund man. He started breaking down. You can see it in Landsman's show. He says, I can't. Because Landsman said, go on, Abe. Abe, keep talking. Tell the story, Abe. He says, it's too horrible, please. Landsman says, we have to do it. You know that, Abe. I can't. I'm not able to do it. You have to, Abe. I know it's very hard and I apologize. Don't make me. Please don't make me go on. Please, Abe, you must go on. I told you today it's going to be very hard. They were taking the hair in bags, transporting it to Germany. Yes, but Abe, what did he say to his wife? What did he say to his sister? What did he say to them? He starts crying. A grown man, a strong man. Remember, this was videoed in 78. He wasn't an old man yet. He was a middle-aged man in 78. He says, they tried talking to him. He couldn't say. What are we going to say? This is the last moments of your life? The SS were standing behind us. We would have died. They would have taken him with his wife and his sister. But in a way, he tried. He tried to do the best for them. You know what he did? He took a few seconds longer. He took a minute longer. He hugged them. He gave them a kiss. Because he knew he's never going to see them again. Redder, the only survivor of Belzec. And the reason I'm reading a few pages of his testimony is because, and I'll share with you at the end some of the books, we have at least a number of testimonies of Auschwitz. This is all we have from Belzec. The train drove into the yard through a wide wooden gate topped with barbed wire. Next to the gate stood a hut where a sentry sat with a telephone. In front of the hut stood several SS men with dogs. When a train had passed through the gate, the sentry closed the gate and went inside. That was when taking delivery of the goods took place. Several dozen SS men, they opened the cars and they screamed, "Raus! Raus!" They drove people out of the cars with whips, rifle butts. The cars had doors that were over a meter above the ground. And all those being herded out, young and old, they had to jump. They broke arms, legs during this. Many fell bleeding, they were dirty, exhausted and tired from the trip. Aside from the SS were the Ukrainian guards. And they were the supervisors of us, the Sonderkommando. The sick, the old, the small children, all the ones who were incapable of walking during the tunnel. The tunnel was the path to their death, to the gas chambers. The ones who were incapable of walking, they were put on stretchers. And they were set down at the edge of the pits, these enormous graves that we dug. The Gestapo man, his name was Fritz German. German, he would take the rifle and he would shoot the elderly and the children. And then he'd kick them into the grave with his rifle butt or his boot. This same airman, who was a specialist at finishing off elderly and small children, a tall, handsome, dark-haired Gestapo man, he lived off campus and he would come to work every day. He appeared in the camp early in the morning. He spent the whole day there. He took delivery of the death transports. As soon as the victims were unloaded, they were assembled in the yard, surrounded by the Ukrainians. And Airman German would give a speech. And there was deathly silence. He stood close to the crowd. And all the Jews wanted to hear, because hope dawned suddenly. If they're speaking to us, maybe we're going to live. Perhaps we're going to go to work. And what did German say? He spoke very loudly and distinctly. Now you are going to the bath. After the bath and after you're disinfected, then you're going to be sent to work. That was all he needed to say. Everyone cheered up. They were happy. We're going to work after all. Some even applauded. I remember his words repeated day in and day out, usually 3 times a day, repeated for months. I was there. It was a moment of hope and a moment of delusion. For an instant, the people breathed easy. There was total calm. The whole crowd moved on in silence. The men straight forward to the yard, to a building that said Bade, baths and inhalation Roma. The women went 20 meters further to a large barracks that were about 30 by 15 meters. The women and the girls had their hair shaved off in the barracks. They entered not knowing why they had been there. The calm and silence lasted a little bit longer. Later on, I saw that only a few minutes later, when they were given wooden stools and lined up across the barracks, they were ordered there to sit on the stools. And that's when the barbers would come in. These barbers, members of the Sonderkommando, were robots, silent as they clipped. They almost scalped the women almost all the way to the scalp. Eventually, the awareness of the truth hit these women. And none of the men on the way to the chambers while the women's hair was being cut could have any doubts any longer. All of them, except for a few men selected as essential skilled laborers to become members of the Sonderkommando, or carpenters, or masons, all of them, young and old, women and children, all of them were going to certain death. Little girls with long hair were herded in to be shaved, while the smallest girls with scant hair, they were put with the men to go in first. Suddenly, without any transition between the hope and the ultimate despair, there were laments and shrieks. Many women had fits of madness, yet many other women went to their deaths coolly, especially the younger women. Our transport contained thousands of intellectuals, of white-collar workers, and you'll hear descriptions that we're not going into of the length of these trains. Many young men, but most on the train were women. I stood off to the side in the yard, together with a small group picked to dig the graves, watching my brothers, my sisters, my acquaintances, my friends, my townsfolk being driven to their death. While the women were being herded forward naked and shaved, whipped like cattle to the slaughter, without being counted. Faster, faster! The men had already died in the first gassing. It took more or less 2 hours to wipe out, to annihilate a whole train. Several dozen SS men used whips, sharp bayonets to drive the women into the gas chamber. And the chambers, and there were 3, held up to 750 people in each chamber. Women who balked at entering were bayoneted in the body by the Ukrainians. The blood flowed. And that is how they were driven into this evil place. I heard the doors closing and the moans and the screams. I heard desperate cries in Yiddish and in Polish. Those blood-chilling laments of the children and the women, I'll never forget. It lasted 15 minutes. The diesel engine ran for 20 minutes, and after 20 minutes, it was quiet. The Ukrainians opened the doors from the outside, and I, together with the other workers, we're sent to work. We dragged the bodies of people who had all been alive not long ago. We used leather straps to drag them to the huge, waiting mass graves. And the orchestra. The orchestra played during all of this. The orchestra played from morning to evening. One of the very few, the only other testimony we have of Belzec was not from a Jew because there was only one Jew. The other testimony came from in German. The man's name was Kurt Gerstein. We have his written testimony. His story is fascinating. It's in a number of places. One of the places is this was published by SUNY Press. It's called Writing and Witness. It's very, very key testimonies in this book. What was the story of Kurt Gerstein? He originally was a German who was anti-Nazi, anti the regime. He was taken, he was forced, he was a scientist, he was a chemist. And what happened? They had him in labs where they were working on chemicals to expedite the death of the Jews because carbon monoxide took too long, took 15 to 20 minutes. They wanted something that would do the job smoother, quicker, so they could do it faster. The other thing is he was working on chemicals that would serve as a disinfectant of Jewish clothing, of other affects that they wanted to clean and bring back, to the homeland. He is probably the only one that's, unfortunately you'll hear he didn't survive, but the only surviving person who had been to all 3 death camps. There were SS who had been there. Christian Worth oversaw what was called Operation Reinhardt after Reinhard Heydrich was killed by the Czech partisans in 1942. It was the annihilation of 3 million Polish Jews. So he was brought to all 3, and he was told by a monster, not a human being, a monster, Odelia Globachnik. You know who Odelia Globachnik was? He was the SS man that oversaw the Lublin district. The Lublin district was not the part, what's known as the general government, which the Germans annexed to Germany. Krakow was part of that. This was the massive body of Poland under German control. And he was told, you ever tell anyone what you saw, we'll kill you. People have been killed for much less than this. For getting much, much farther away, they've been killed for even seeing this. Do you understand? And they took Gerstein in. And I can't read it because it's too horrific. It's there. He describes it in a much more raw, powerful fashion even than Rudolf Reder, the Jew, did. And he said, this is a German Lutheran. He says, I saw them praying. He says, I was praying to their God and my God. And he says, all I wanted to do was to jump in with them. I mean, he was terrified by it. He was shocked by it. And he fled. He left his chemical lab. He went to 3 groups. He wrote out what he saw to 3 groups. the Dutch underground. He got to the Swedish, and he went to the papal nuncio. That was the first he went to, the papal nuncio in Berlin, that word should get to the Pope, that word should get to the Vatican. The Vatican claims no record of this. The Vatican doesn't know anything about it. All we know is he went to the papal nuncio. Did the papal nuncio share it with his superiors at the Vatican? One would assume so. We don't know. This is one of the things that actually is one of the most precious things we're looking for now that Pope Francis has opened up the archives of Pope Pius to see if they didn't destroy this, if there's a record of this. What did they know in 1942? Because he came to Belzec and Treblinka and Sobibor in August of 42, in the midst of all this was going on. You know what his story was? After the war, because he had worked for the Germans, he was put, like many other prisoners, and he was incarcerated. Somehow somebody knew who he was, and he was put with some pretty high-level SS. They killed him. They murdered him in prison, his fellow Germans. They made it look like it's a suicide, and initially the record said it was a suicide, but it's clear to anyone who studied history, and it's clear to anyone who knew anything about him, they murdered him. But we have his testimony. I apologize. I want to wrap this up, conclude. I want to go back to just the face that haunts me. I don't want to use his name because members of his own family don't know what he experienced. But this man who just sat there and stared into space, this man who had this scary, haunting face, who was being destroyed, devoured by the ghost that he had suppressed, the ghost that he had squelched his whole life. Just in the end of his life, devoured him. No doctor could understand, no doctor could describe physically that there was anything wrong with him. And you know, the image, those who've seen Shoah, that face of Philip Muller, watching him describe what he experienced, he was a haunted man the rest of his life. You know what else haunts me? This Chaim Hirschman, one of two survivors who was murdered on the day he went to testify. You know what else haunts me? Rudolf Redder, the one survivor. What happened to him? No trace of him. Don't know. These men, most of them were young men when they were chosen for this. They lost their adolescence. They lost their youth. They lost, for sure, their innocence. Their life was taken from them. I don't mean physically. I'm talking about their life was taken from them. They continued to live. They defied all odds. The chance of a member of the Sonderkommando surviving was zero. And I apologize, I never came back and told, how did we get more than one or two from Auschwitz? When the Russians were coming, and literally by the day taking over territory, and they were in Western Galicia, and Auschwitz would have been liberated. So I believe the date was January 18th. I have to look it up, January 18th or 20th. They rounded up everyone. The SS, what you and I know as the Death March. And they marched them in the mid, you're talking about January, the cold of January. It was 20 degrees below Celsius when that started, that Death March. Minus 20 that day in Galicia. And they were calling out after they rounded up, we're looking for members of Sonderkommando, we're looking for members of Sonderkommando. These guys were smart. They dispersed themselves amongst all the other slave laborers, amongst all the other Jews. The difference between them and other Jews is, except for maybe the Canada bunk, where people also had a greater caloric intake because they would take from the suitcases and eat, they actually had a little bit of, I wouldn't call it fat, but they had a little bit of meat on their bones. And they didn't acknowledge that there was Sonderkommando. They made themselves like everyone else. That's why we have survivors from Auschwitz. But these men who lost their innocence, who defied all odds to survive, they saw the annihilation of 1/3 of Am Yisrael, 1/3 of our people, 1.5 million children. And they're the ones who bore the burden of our nation. Please God that you and I, that we never forget their sacrifice and their legacy. Because they're the ones who are the living testimony. You know, we're called the Jewish people, Adat Yisrael, Adat Yeshua. What's an Ada? We're the people that testify. We're the living witnesses that God created this universe, that God runs this universe, that God is a God of ethics and morals, that God is a God that wants humanity's perfection. We're his witnesses. These were our witnesses. These are the witnesses to the greatest atrocity in the history of humanity. And they sacrificed. And it affected their marriages, it affected their ability to be fathers, it affected their relationship with God, it affected the rest of their lives. Please God that we never forget them. But not just never forget them. Please God that we should be their legacy. They gave a legacy. They testified to what happened to our nation. We should be their legacy. We should testify to their sacrifice. Not only their sacrifice during the Shoah, but their sacrifice to function to the best of their ability, to try to survive and tell the story to the world. These men made the greatest sacrifice maybe of any human being. Any human being is made in history because of what they had to live through and what they had to bear. Go back to what Himmler said to a meeting, a high-level meeting of SS officers in Polish, in Poznan, we say in German and Posen, on October 4th, 1943. I'm going to just quote that again. This is a glorious page in our history, but it never has been, nor will it ever be written down. These are the ones who wrote it down. They're the ones who told the story. We remember them on Yom HaShoah. We remember their sacrifice, but we don't just remember them. We live. We live, we tell our children, we rebuild the Jewish people. We rebuild everything they describe to us. We rebuild and we give a living memorial to those who can't live. We bring them back to life through our children, our grandchildren, our schools, the land of Israel, the people of Israel, the nation of Am Yisrael, be they in Israel or the diaspora. And these rare individuals, they were the link, and they're the ones who told us what happened. And they gave us a reason to rebuild, a desire to rebuild, a challenge to rebuild, and a demand that we rebuild Am Yisrael, the Torah of Israel, and that we reestablish the religion of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Weil, for addressing our community during our annual Yom HaShoah program. As always, your presentations are eloquent, extremely well-researched, and captivating. And it's wonderful to have you join our community and address us once again. Please God, only happy occasions to you and your family. And please give your attention to Chazim Alavani, who will now recite the Kal Malay Memorial Prayer.
Thank you, Rabbi Babich. I just wanted to tell you, Rabbi Weil, that, can you hear me, Rabbi Weil?
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry, it's so difficult to follow you, and I hate to use the word presentation. This was a live spiritual matzeva to the Sonderkommandos and after that to stand up and just to sing the Kel Maleh, as much koach that I will put in will never be able to be compared to your presentation. So I want to share Rabbi Babich's comment to you and to give you a big yashar koach. And I hope that you will get many, many more opportunities, especially with young people, to tell them this outstanding, heroic story. Thank you very much. Eile male rachamim, shochein bameromi, hamtzei menucha mechoyena, Conferi Hashechina Bemahalos Kedoshim Utehorim Kezoar Arakia Meirim Umazirim Lenishemos Shisha Mileyonei Acheino Meyachiyoseino Anoshim Noshim Evotav Shenehergo Veshenishchato Veshenislevo Veshenechenako Veshenik Beruch Chaim Bidei Hatzorerim Hagermanim Hanazim Veyozreihem Yemach Shemam Vezichram V'she'alechu le'olamam Kulam kedoshim uteyorim Uvahem geonim v'tzadikim Arzei Levanon Adirei Atoero Beganei Baal Rachamim Yastirei Beseise Kenafal Leyolamim Leitzro Bitzor HaChaim es nishmoseihem Adonai hu nachalasom ve'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkevoseihem ve'yamedo
We now sing the Ani Mamin.
I'd like to move to the piano. Give me a second, please, Rabbi. And
We'll be singing the Ani Mamim, and as we always do, followed by the Hatikva.
okay. Can you see me here, Rabbi?
We can hear you, yes. Thank you so much, Chazan Malavani. Thank you, Rabbi Weil. Please God, may our community, our nation, and entire world experience happier times, the Karov, in the very near future. We thank everyone for joining us, and please God, everyone should be blessed with health, happiness, and safety in the coming days. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.